Hello, my name is Caleb Smith. I'm the editor at the Rocket Miner. I'd like to welcome you to Rocket Talks, and we're looking at the election 2020. I'm joined today by Chelsey McMicheal. What's your title here at the Rocket Miner?
I'm just the marketing consultant, but I like to have fun with you guys and do this.
And that is certainly true. And more importantly, we're here with...
Hi, I'm Yana Ludwig, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate seat that Mike Enzi is stepping out of.
All right. And there are certain cliched questions that I must apologize up front that we are going to ask.
Go for it.
Why are you running for U.S. Senate?
Well, I'm definitely in that category of somebody who never thought they would do this. But about a year ago, I started waking up in the middle of the night and having this, you should be running for office thing going through my head. And after about 2 months of internal debate, I finally went, okay, maybe I should be listening to this. And, what I realized is that I'm somebody who's been involved as an activist in many different issues over the years, from climate and land preservation, sort of that ecological stuff, to women's and LGBTQ rights, and most recently gotten involved with anti-police violence activism and anti-racism work. And it was like, it seems like all of the things that are really up in this country right now are things that I actually have a fair bit of experience with. And I also listen for a living. I'm a professional facilitator, and I think there's not enough listening happening right now among our elected officials, and they're sort of on their tracks, and they've got their people that they're listening to, but it's not really regular people. So I feel like I get to bring those skill sets into this and, bring it into a bigger level than what I've worked on before.
As part of your campaign, what are you hoping to accomplish? There's the race itself, but then there are goals that you have along the way, and usually everybody has that, whether or not they're the one sitting in that spot at the end, or whether they get to the end and, as the sports editor liked to say, they came in second place.
Well, for me, a really good second place finish would be that we have opened up a bunch of conversations in Wyoming that we typically haven't been having politically around what does a post-carbon dependent Wyoming look like, and what is socialism? I do actually identify as a socialist, and I'm not avoiding the S word with this whole thing, but I think there's a lot of misperceptions out there, and some of those have been deliberately fostered, and some of them are just that we don't educate people about different kinds of economic systems very well. So I would love to actually have people know better what does that word actually mean at the end of this. And I've also been thinking a lot about the word freedom and sort of reclaiming what that actually means. And I was actually just thinking about it on the way over here, if you don't mind that I just sort of dip into that a little bit. So, for me, what I feel like real freedom would be is economic security. If you have the freedom to actually go to the doctor, or send your dad to the doctor, or your kid to the doctor when they need to go, or you have the freedom to get the kind of education that you want to get, whether that's trade school or a 4-year degree, or just having enough leisure in your life that you can read books. And, if you have the freedom to have children, which a lot of young people right now are starting to feel like they don't have, other sort of, more remote versions of freedom don't really mean a lot if we don't have that material freedom in our lives. And so, it doesn't mean a lot if you're stuck in an abusive relationship because your partner is the one whose insurance keeps you alive. Or if you're a farmer and your farm is, underwater for the third time in 10 years with a 100-year flood because the climate is destabilizing, and that was your economic anchor, or you're working 2 or even 3 jobs and you can't afford an apartment. What does freedom mean under those circumstances? And so I think the kind of freedom that I'm really interested in is the kind that's won in union halls and in the streets sometimes and at the ballot box. And, and so I'm sort of realizing that I kind of want us to reclaim that word and sort of reconceptualize what does freedom really mean? And so I think that's becoming one of my new sub-goals with this whole campaign.
Okay.
Very nice. So what makes you a good candidate, especially for the state of Wyoming?
Well, one of the things is that I'm working class, and we don't have electeds that are, that actually get what it's like to economically struggle. And, also I think the fact that I do I have background that lets me know that it is possible to actually have a really good life without being super carbon dependent, carbon emissions dependent, and I want to be able to bring some of that experience in.
So we did talk about that before between you and I when we had our first interview. You said that you are for the coal industry here in Wyoming because that is something that, not that we depend, I would like to say that we have to depend on, but what are your goals of educating people into more of solar power and wind power? How would we be taking steps towards that in Wyoming for these people, say at the Jim Purger plant, that are losing their jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm not pro-coal so much as I'm pro-workers, which includes coal workers. I don't actually care if some rich guy continues to make a bunch of money off of Wyoming. Like, that's not something that I'm actually interested in protecting. But I do want us to have good jobs. I do want economic security to be a high priority. And so, I think what we're seeing is still a lot of resistance to diversifying our economy, even though we have, yes, we have abundant minerals under the land, but we also have abundant resources in terms of sun and wind in Wyoming. It's one of the best states for both of those. And so I think, moving that conversation along and, just helping people also be okay with the fact that I think people are panicking because coal is dying, and that's a really real thing. And I get frustrated sometimes with some other people on the left who are super heartless about that and are like, well, just retrain or just get a different job. And it's like, no, this is like people's identity, to a large extent. And so I want to be really real about that.
How do you feel about these big companies coming into Wyoming, and they are, I worked out at the solar plant out between here and Kemmer. How do you feel about those companies coming here and bringing workers from Nevada and Arizona and literally out there, they hired maybe 20 guys from Wyoming compared to 300 guys from different states.
I think there should totally be a priority with all of these. The coal industry did that too. They were bringing people in from Texas and Arkansas. And so I think that there should be priority on employing people who already live here. And I think that should be true in every state because people don't want to lose their community. They don't want to have to leave Wyoming, and we don't necessarily want a bunch of people coming in who they're just coming for the job and they're not coming because they love this place. And so I do think that it should be prioritized.
And they're not coming here and paying state taxes like they do in their own states.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Tell us a little bit more about your background, where you come from, how you got here.
Well, so my professional background is mostly in the nonprofit sector. Okay. So I've been in that sector for about 30 years and, done some time on boards of directors and lots of time in the executive director seat with different nonprofits. I also have lived in residential intentional communities, which is probably the most unusual thing about my background, which is just groups of people who live together based on shared goals and shared values. And one of the interesting things that I think that brings for me is that my experience with policy development is very direct and very intimate. It's not like there's the decision makers over here and there's the people who are being affected by it over here. To me, it's almost always been the exact same group of people, and I think that immediacy is something that Washington could use a little bit more of.
Okay.
I came to Wyoming for love, actually. I was very contentedly living in rural Missouri and fell in love with a guy who has really deep connections in Wyoming. He was the debate coach at the University of Wyoming for 11 years, and his kids, now my stepkids, had never lived anywhere else. And so when it came time that we were like, oh, this is actually a serious relationship, it was clearly I was going to be the one to move. And so sometimes I say that I came for love and I stayed for the public schools and public lands, which is pretty much why we're here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are the most important topics facing Wyoming in your opinion?
Well, I definitely think the economic stuff we've been talking about is huge, and healthcare is really big. Talking to young people, they're really concerned about student debt issues. They're concerned about the suicide epidemic. I have talked to many young people, and almost all of them have already lost someone, and they're 20 years old, and they've already lost somebody to suicide. So I think that that's a very serious issue. And I also think we have electeds right now who are doing their best to undermine our public land system and to some extent our public school system. And so I really want to make sure that those public assets stay public.
Just with those, can you go into a little bit more examples of areas or things that you're critical of or that you wish were done differently? when it comes to, we'll start with public lands.
Start with public lands. Yeah, so Cynthia Lemus, who I'm running against, is actually part of an organization whose explicit goal is to get federal lands sold to states, whether or not those states have the capacity to actually manage those public lands. And it's kind of an end run around like, oh, well, there's still public lands, except that the goal is ultimately to get those lands privatized. And so I'm very critical of that. And, Liz Cheney has also played some of those games. And certainly all of them have, barreled ahead with like, yes, we should be doing more and more, fossil fuel development on those lands instead of using those lands for like, solar and wind and other things, or just for recreation. I mean, you pretty much trash land when you are doing coal mining on it. My dad is an ecologist, and one of the things I got to do as a kid was go with him to mine sites that he had been the ecologist who had been hired to do the land reclamation work on them. And it was pretty much barren and trashed. And that is really, really, really not what I want for Wyoming. And that seems to be what our electeds are really pushing for.
Okay. Then how about public education?
Well, actually, this is more Foster Freeze and his whole trip than it is, like our federal electeds. But I would really like to see us being clear about protecting. I mean, I think that the public schools in Wyoming are some of the best in the country. I moved 3 times when my son was school age, and we didn't put him into the public schools in most of those places because they weren't very good, and I would have had no issue with putting him into the Wyoming public schools. So I really want us to be clear that we're protecting something that I think is a really great asset for the state.
Along with that, what do you think is a great idea to have more teachers want to come to Wyoming? Right now, a lot of teachers in Wyoming are extended substitutes, and we have a big issue with that here in Sweetwater County.
Oh, okay, interesting. I didn't know it was particularly an issue here. So, I mean, I'm in favor of Bernie Sanders' proposal that like there should be a minimum salary of $60,000 a year for teachers. I think it's really, really important work. And the fact that teachers are often not paid very well. And we're better in Wyoming than we are in a lot of states about that, actually. But I think Medicare for All would make people be able to choose where they live based on where they want to live rather than based on what the benefits packages are in different places. And, the state right now in Wyoming is seriously considering getting rid of a bunch of benefits for state employees. And so we're actually going backward on that one at the moment. That is not going to help get teachers excited about being here. It's not going to help fill the 1,400 open positions right now that we have in state government. It's like it doesn't make any sense at all if we're serious about reversing the trend of losing population.
Talking about healthcare, let's go more a little bit of that. Especially, I know that you are as you said, you're a proponent of Medicare for All.
I am. Yep, I am. I mean, I believe that Medicare for All is one of the key things that would help. I mean, obviously help individuals. We'd have, like I say, a lot more freedom in our lives if healthcare wasn't an issue in terms of what work we're taking or not. I think it would help small businesses because a lot of small businesses lose the best employees to big businesses that can afford these like big fancy packages of benefits that they can't afford. And I also just think it's a human rights issue. I mean, we have a huge percentage of Americans who are either uninsured or underinsured or have private insurance, and that private insurance basically acts like a gatekeeper. They tell you what doctor you can go to. They tell you whether or not you can get treatment. That your doctor may be saying this person really needs this treatment, and I don't actually think that private insurance has any inherent benefit. It is literally just a gatekeeper between us and our insurance and us and our medical care. And 30% of the costs of health care in the United States aren't health care at all. They're private insurance costs. And that's ridiculous. It's completely insane. There's no way that we should be forking over that much money basically for CEOs that have like some of the highest pay anywhere in the United States are in the insurance industry. And like, I'm not interested in supporting your third yacht. I'm interested in being able to take my kid to the doctor.
So what do you think are some strong points of Bernie's plan with paying for Medicaid for All, and what do you think are the weak points in the plan that he just recently released?
Well, I mean, I think that the weak points are, aren't really inherent in the plan. I think they're about, basically political will more than anything else. I mean, I think the strong points are that he is the only one who's actually recommending getting rid of private insurance entirely. And, if you think about it, so if we had a dual system where we had Medicare for everyone who wants it, to use Pete Buttigieg's kind of dorky statement, and private insurance, I mean, basically the people who need coverage the most are going to gravitate toward the public system, because insurance companies are going to have even more freedom to say no to you about stuff. And what that means is that it's going to be way more expensive for the government to be doing that public option, because the more serious medical things are going to gravitate toward that system. And I think Bernie's really smart to be talking about entirely eliminating that, both for costs and because I think we're going to end up with this kind of dual citizen thing going on with healthcare, and it's like, this is not the place to be playing those games.
So do you think that that Americans with private health insurance or health insurance that their jobs are providing for them, do you think that they are going to pay the same amount in taxes as they pay for their insurance right now anyway?
Well, it depends on how much you make. I mean, the plan that Bernie has, basically the first $29,000, there's no cost at all to the program, except for possibly $200 a year for prescriptions. So if you make less than $29,000 a year, the most you're going to pay for much more broad coverage than most private insurers give, because it's mental health coverage, it's dental, it's vision, it's long-term care, which is a huge issue for seniors. So all those things are going to be included. If you make more than $29,000 a year, it's 4% tax. And so, for the vast majority of people, our overall healthcare costs are going to go down by thousands of dollars a year. Now, if you make a lot of money, you may be paying more, but if you make a lot of money, you can afford to pay more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think mine went down, what I calculated, it would go down $2,800 per year.
Yeah. I think our family would be saving $7,000 to $8,000 a year.
Nice.
Yeah.
When it comes to where we're directing our paychecks and whatnot, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about minimum wage and the pay gap, which is something that we've talked with you before in the past, or I know Chelsey has.
Yeah.
Because I read her notes.
Okay, good. I think there's lots of different layers to it. I mean, one of them is, that phrase pay gap often gets applied to, there's a gap between what women make and what men make, what people of color make and white people make. And so, I think we need to be doing a number of things to close that pay gap. Okay. And one of the practices that keeps that locked in is that employers right now consider it to be a good practice to ask somebody, what did you make at your last job? And what that does is, when you are in one of those categories where you've already been getting paid less, that just perpetuates, because then your employer is allowed to go, oh, well, then I'll pay you $2,000 more than you were making, even if that happens to be $20,000 less than the white guy is making. So I think that we can look at hiring practices with some of this. Okay. I am in favor of raising the minimum wage, and 15 is okay, but it's actually not a livable wage in a lot of places in the country. We have been really, really slow to keep up with minimum wages. If it had kept track with what it was in 1963, I think it is, it'd be $23 an hour. And so I really think we need to bump that up. I'm also really concerned about the gap between your average worker and your average CEO, which is 361 times what workers make. That's horrific. And so one of the particular things that I'm interested in doing is actually proposing a wage ratio law. Okay. And wage ratios are a thing that were developed in mostly in the worker-owned cooperative and some of the more social justice-oriented nonprofit world. And basically what it says is that the highest paid person in the company can't be making X times the lowest paid person in the company. And in the early 1950s, when actually a middle class wage could get you a house and a car and an education, that wage gap, it was about 20 to 1 at that point. And so that's what I would go in and propose, and I'm sure that would go through Jungle Ball in DC and might not get anywhere, but I would propose it every year that I'm there. And what it basically says is so if you're such a hot shot that you're really good at making money, that's fine. You can make $3 million a year. You're just going to have to figure out how to bring everybody else up with you.
Okay.
So you don't get to skyrocket your wages, leaving everybody else out of that. If the company's going to be successful, everybody should be getting the benefit of that success.
So AOC actually pointed that out the other day.
For those people who don't know all the acronyms,
Alexandria
Say her full name.
Ocasio-Cortez. Yes.
So she did say that the other day in one of those Now This videos that we were stealing the workers' work and making millions of dollars. So you didn't make that what her point was is you didn't make those millions of dollars, you took those millions of dollars.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, so we have billionaires in the world right now. We have some of them on the stage of the presidential elections right now, and there is no way that their time and life energy and skills were worth that much more, like millions of times more than yours. Like, I just don't buy that. Like, I think there's like some faults in the system if that's the outcome that we can get.
Okay.
Your stance on gun control.
So I'm basically pro Second Amendment. The leverage point that I see, gun violence is a serious issue, and over half of the men, and I'm going to say men because it is almost all men, who have done these mass shooting events, over half of them have domestic violence charges on their records. And so the one place, like, I think the most effective thing that we could do is we can say, if you're actually a domestic abuser, you should lose your rights to own guns. And that, to me, would be the single most effective thing that we could do. I'm generally not in favor of disarmament, and part of it is that, like, we have a police violence issue in this country. And I know many, many people who are very nervous about, you take away our guns, but the police still are fully loaded, and there's a lot of people really, really nervous about that. And so I'm interested in doing the domestic violence, closing that gap, and then pausing and having some much bigger conversations about violence in general in the United States before we would go anywhere else with it. And then I'm skeptical that I would get on board with going anywhere else with it at this point.
So something that our neighboring states have already kind of surpassed us by many, many years, marijuana.
Should be legal.
Plain and simple?
Period.
No argument against it?
Well, and I think we should expunge the records of people who had nonviolent marijuana-related charges because, people's lives have been ruined because they had a couple joints in their house and got arrested. Like, that's ridiculous, and it should absolutely just be legal.
So we did talk about that in our interview. What about other recreational drugs?
Well, I think that we've done a weird thing in this country, which is that we've criminalized drug use instead of seeing drug abuse as being a healthcare issue, and I think it should be reclassified as a healthcare issue. And so, people who have drug charges, again, like nonviolent drug charges, who got hurt really in those cases, and dealing is a little bit different than using. And so, I think there's some subtlety to it, but I really think that we need to have a pretty serious reframe of how we think about drugs in general in this country.
So one thing that you and I did talk about, what are your plans to change that the governor of Wyoming is the only one capable of pardoning felonies for drug users?
For drug users, yeah. Well, and this is a voting rights issue. I mean, this is, it should not just be like one person's whim. Like which individuals am I going to give their lives back to is kind of what that is, because it's an employment issue. You can't get a job necessarily if you have felony drug charges on your record, and you can't vote, if you have any kind of felony. And so I think that the voting rights thing, we should just make it so that if you're a citizen, you get to vote. And I like automatic voter registration and a bunch of other stuff along that. But I don't think that's a right you should be able to lose, because the laws still affect you. You're still at effect of what's happening in D.C. and happening in Cheyenne. And then I think, a pretty large reframing so that we're moving away from criminalization thinking in general.
Okay.
Immigration is another thing we're a little bit farther away from the border, but we have a lot of people passing through, be it I-80 or all the jobs that come with the boom. What are your opinions on that?
Well, here's the deal. My great-grandmother, Nellie, came from Ireland. She was the last of my, ancestors who came here, and she came in, there was a little bit of paperwork. She entered the country.
Okay.
And it's a little weird to me, like how attached we are to this whole idea of like borders. Like we have borders between states. So when I cross the border into Colorado, I have to start abiding by Colorado's laws. If I moved there, I would have to abide by Colorado's tax structures and all that kind of stuff. But the world doesn't fall apart when I cross the border into Colorado. And we make such a huge deal out of borders, I think, in general.
Sometimes when it's the road conditions, there's a little bit of difference.
Well, and the wind. I've noticed this thing that, like, you cross into Wyoming and you suddenly get slammed with the wind.
It's weird.
We need to be talking to somebody else about that, though. But, you know,
But the bigger picture
the bigger
stuff.
picture is, like, I think that we need to not completely open our borders, but pretty significantly move back in that direction from where we are right now. I mean, the people who are in cages, who are dealing with family separations down at the border, came to the place they were supposed to come to request legal asylum. They were following our rules, and we took their children away and put them in cages. And I don't know how people do not see that as just an absolutely appalling human rights violation. And I think a lot of people do. And so, like, we're not doing a very good job with this. And I can also say from my own experience that my first husband was Australian, and the paperwork was this fat, and it took years to get through that system. And it's like, why do we make it so incredibly difficult when we get so much out of having immigrants here? I mean, probably, unless, one of us is African American whose family was brought here as slaves or are indigenous, we were all immigrants at some point. And the fact that we now somehow have gotten into this thing of like immigration is bad, it's like, where do you think this country came from? I mean, the nature of the country on top of the land is an immigrant's place.
So how do we as individuals, do you feel like we can change our neighbors' views on immigration, besides obviously going on Facebook and going on and on and on about it and arguing with it?
Because everybody changes their minds when they see a Facebook
exactly.
argument.
I saw it happen once. I've seen it happen.
Yeah,
That's more than I've seen.
Rock Springs in
I'm glad.
itself is home to 56 nationalities. We celebrate that during the summer, but yet we have, our next door neighbors arguing with us about immigrants.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the best way to change people's minds is more about listening than it is about telling, and like trying to understand like what is people's anxiety, like what is it about, and like trying to like help them understand that like maybe it's like the wrong fix to what our anxieties are. I mean, I think there's been a lot of a lot of stories about like immigrants are taking your jobs and that kind of thing. And I think that hits home really hard when people are struggling economically. And it's easy to buy into that because it gives someone to focus on. I was on, I'm part of a different podcast, and I just interviewed somebody as the interviewer over in Evanston who's part of the immigrant community there. And they're really, really scared about this. Excuse me. I'll start over.
Take your time.
All right, not froggy. Okay, great. So I'm also part of a podcast, and I just interviewed somebody over in Evanston who's part of the immigrant community there, and they are really, really scared about this immigration prison coming in.
Yeah.
They are, and it doesn't matter if they're naturalized citizens or DACA recipients or first generation, and there's not a concern about their citizenship, or undocumented people. They're watching their relatives get slowly siphoned out of this country and sent home. Some of them have never even been to the countries that they're being sent to, and they're really scared. And one of the things that she pointed out to me was if the immigrant community just up and left Evanston, because of this thing that's coming in that's being pit against. Yeah, well,
yeah.
And it's being pitched like, we're going to have all these great new jobs. And this person was like, and then you're going to lose half of your immigrant population and suddenly not have enough people to fill even the jobs that are already in Evanston, let alone all these new jobs. And that's when then you get a bunch of people getting imported from other states. And she was like, this is madness. And I agree with that. I mean, we're not thinking about people from other countries as if they're human beings and as if they are our neighbors. And I think we need to do that.
This will overlap with some of the things we've already touched on, but human rights is a big part of your. You have many logs in the fire, so to speak, when it comes to that. Let's talk about some of those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think so. I'm the first, I think, out member of the LGBTQ community who's running for a statewide office in Wyoming. And it's been amazing how much the queer community has been like showing up to support, because it's like they've never had anybody like them running for office. And so I think that's a population that's been really neglected. And there's some pretty serious unsafety issues, for folks, for the queer community in Wyoming. And so there's that piece. There's also, disabled people. I mean, people with disabilities are the largest minority in the U.S., and they feel very neglected. The conversations that I've had is they feel really neglected by our current electeds. And so that's a population. And then, obviously the immigrant population and people of color. I have a number of friends who grew up in Wyoming. They're, they're first generation, or they've been here even longer than that, and they're people of color. And it was a rough place to grow up for a lot of them. And, so really looking at, I think we need to be getting back to a politics that is rehumanizing other people instead of dehumanizing other people. And that's got lots of different pieces to it, for sure.
Okay.
All right. Do you have any comments on the other people who are in the race with you?
Well, I mean, Cynthia Lemus is about as right as you get. And so she and I are pretty much polar opposites in terms of, our general orientations with stuff. I mean, she was a founding member of the Freedom Caucus, which, are the kind of people who are going around Wyoming right now telling half of the Republicans in the state that they're Republican in name only and that kind of stuff. I mean, it's very divisive. And Cynthia Lemus scares me. I mean, she's kind of, Donald Trump, but female. And I have a lot of respect for Merav Ben-David, who's the other Democrat who's gotten into the race. I think she's really smart. She and I actually sat down and had a really great conversation with each other, and she and I are both comfortable with the framing that she's the Elizabeth Warren and I'm the Bernie Sanders in the race. And and I want people to get clear about what those differences are and actually vote based on policy. I'm excited to have somebody who's an immigrant in the race. I think that's great. I don't know a lot about the other Republicans who are in the race. I mean, Josh Wheeler's very focused on veterans issues, and that's sort of his home grounding, and I think veterans issues are really important, so I'll be curious to see if we actually have debates that people show up for. I'm going to be real curious to learn more about Josh and his positions on things.
So, speaking of this, how do you feel about the bill coming up about not being able to switch sides?
I think it's ridiculous. I mean, the primaries are where a lot of really important things happen in the primaries, and people getting to be able, I think voting rights has to include you get to vote for who you want to vote for. I actually had this funny story. I don't know if I told you this story or not when we talked before, but I was one of the people that switched parties in the last election to vote for Charlie Hardy, because I actually genuinely thought Charlie was the most interesting person in the race, and he was running as a Republican. And then I spaced it out and didn't switch my party affiliation back, and when I went to talk to the state Democratic Party about running, they were like, "Oh, do you realize you're registered as a Republican?" I was like, "Oh, that was a Charlie Hardy moment." And so I don't think it should matter what I'm not much of a party loyalist in a lot of ways, and I just think you should be able to vote for who you want to vote for. I would love to have ranked choice voting actually in Wyoming, so that we could pick, so that I could go, I want Charlie Hardy and then Travis Helm, or whatever order I would have put it in. I mean, that would have been great. That would have felt a lot more nuanced and honest, I guess, than just pick one.
I just have a lot of write-in votes.
There
is that way of doing it too. Right?
So, any words on the person you're looking to replace, Mike Enzi?
Mike Enzi he's a classic conservative. We have a lot of disagreements about policy issues, and everything that I've heard about Senator Enzi in terms of his direct relationships, when you go to your senator's office and you say, "Hey, I need help with X, Y, and Z," Enzi has been amazing as far as I can tell with that. And so I'm actually hoping that if I win this, that he'll be willing to have lunch with me and like sit down and like let me kind of pick his brain, because I feel like he's done a really stellar job. And that's sort of the less public part of the job, but it's an incredibly important part of the job. And from what I can tell, Enzi's been great on that front. So
yeah.
yeah.
And at least he comes to Wyoming.
Right, it's true. It's true.
One of the things you said toward the start was that you're not backing away from the socialist label. You want, please take some time to talk about what you believe, the perception and your perceived misperceptions that are out there.
Well, I think that people hear socialism, and what they hear is the government's going to own everything, everybody's going to have to work for the government, and that's the deal, and it's going to be this sort of monolithic thing. Which has nothing to do with the kind of socialism that I'm interested in. I mean, socialism, like capitalism, plays out in a lot of different ways. The crux of it is a democratized economy. Okay. And for me, the part that I'm the most excited about that is worker ownership. And so, you know, if you can imagine for a moment how different all the stuff that's gone down with the coal mines closing, how would that have been different if the coal miners were the ones who actually owned that company? You know, they would not have been caught off guard. They would not have shown up at the bank on Friday evening and had their checks bounce, which was horrible. Yeah. They would not have given a person a $2 million bonus while stripping all of their benefits away from them. And they would have been the ones who would have been looking at the information and going like, okay, do we need to do layoffs here? Do we need to reboot our system? You know, do we need to think about diversifying within our own company? And so worker ownership is a time-tested model that is much more stable. People tend to be much more committed to making businesses work when they own it. You know, we see small business owners who are, they work 80 hours a week to make it happen. So it's it's sort of an extension of that into like everybody in the company having that kind of commitment to it and having, making major decisions democratically. And small organizations can do all their decisions democratically. Bigger ones usually have, your managers are elected, and they're usually elected on an annual basis. And so it's really democratizing how things work. And that's, Marx's whole thing was, who owns the means of production? That's the crux. And so, for me, that's really what socialism means is let's actually get the power back into our local communities and into the hands of workers instead of having a separate owning class.
Okay.
So what have you seen or learned that's interesting while campaigning?
So much about the suicide epidemic. So much. I had a really sort of heart-wrenching conversation with a guy in Evanston who's a police officer and works in a suicide prevention program there. And he and I got into a long conversation at a fair last summer. And he was basically saying that he feels like the crux of what's driving it, at least for men, and working class white men are some of the most common suicides that we have right now, is that, men don't have good social support. I mean, I think if we had better mental health care in Wyoming, we'd have, I've lost somebody to suicide because she couldn't get mental health care in Wyoming. And so I think that's been the thing that the most tender thing that I didn't realize was as bad as it is. I think that's probably the one that stands out the most.
Okay.
Are you excited for bowling tonight? And
I'm excited for bowling tonight.
Your events at China Garden tomorrow?
Yeah, I suck at bowling.
Yeah,
so
I saw that on your Facebook.
This is going to be really fun. I think it's really important for everybody to have places in their lives where your ego just has no chance of getting a foothold. And bowling is one of those places for me. And so actually, when it was first suggested, I was like, bowling? But I actually really like bowling, and I think it's going to be really fun. But yeah, I do suck at it.
And China Garden tomorrow, is everyone in the county invited to come to speak to you?
It's the County Democratic Party has their
monthly meeting.
Yeah. And I think so.
Okay.
Hopefully, I'm not going to get into trouble though, where they're like, it wasn't a public event, so I don't actually know. but I'm fine with people coming.
Yeah, I went to their weekly meeting
Okay.
for lunch, and they're very, very welcoming. So
They're very sweet. This will be
Oh,
the
yeah.
second time that I've done this particular lunch. And the Sweetwater Democratic Party, good folks.
are you going to Salt Lake on Monday?
I'm not.
Okay.
No.
I had to
No.
ask.
No, I am going to be tabling, though, tomorrow morning over at the community college. So if there's students listening to this, come chat me up.
Okay.
Yeah.
When it comes to civic participation, voter turnout, what do you tell people to get them to go out and cast their ballots?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons why people don't vote is that the candidates are not exciting to them. And so I'm trying to be interesting enough and listening enough that it's actually going to be worth showing up at the polls. And, and I think for young people in particular, I realize that right now things can feel pretty hopeless for a lot of young people between climate and the economy and suicides happening all around you. And this is one place where you can do something to make a difference. And I don't think you should vote once every 4 years and then not participate in between. I mean, I'm all about activism. I'm about protest. I'm about, getting in there and actually making your voice heard from whatever platforms you have in your life, whether you're a writer or a teacher or just a student activist, And so I want people to vote and not just think that voting is going to fix everything.
Okay. And anything in particular that you'd suggest that they're keeping in mind when you're down and you're checking the box?
Well, I mean, obviously, I would like people to vote for me. I mean, I think that, I'm in this race because I think I'm going to take the issues that are the most important to the largest number of people really seriously. And, but I would say, read up on people, check out their websites, do your research, and vote based on policy, and try not to buy into these games that we get into about, strategically. But it's no, vote for the person that you actually feel like is going to hold you and your family and the people that you love the best, and have it lead with that. And also pay attention to the money, where people's money is coming from in their campaigns does actually affect how they vote. And so go on opensecrets.org and look. And if that person is getting money from people that you like what they're doing, then they're probably a good match with you. Yeah.
So since we're on the voting topic, what do you think about the Electoral College?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated that the moderation at some of the presidential debates has been terrible. And I really appreciated that question at the tail end of, was it 2 debates ago, where it was so, do you think the person who gets the most votes should be the one who's the nominee? And it's how do we pretend that we're a democracy if that's not the case? And, the fact that the superdelegates have so much more pull than the regular delegates do is, it's a really big deal. And, and those people, it's political games appointments as much as anything else. And some of those people are elected officials and some aren't. And I think we should scrap it. I think we're mature enough now as a people that we can just do one vote, one person, and be okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So how can people connect or get involved with your campaign?
Yeah, so the best email for us is Yana4 at gmail.com, digit 4. And our website is also just Yana4 digit 4 and you can get lots of information about my different policy things there. There's also a page on there. You were asking about how to talk to neighbors. There's actually is a page on there, a tab that is talking about solidarity, where we have some resources and some help for having those hard conversations. I mean, I think we're going to change the political landscape in Wyoming kind of one painfully awkward conversation at a time, and so we're trying to offer some help with how to actually do that on that page. And then you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. We're about to start doing TikTok.
Okay.
So this is the new thing.
Yes, it is.
And YouTube, we're starting to do more active videos on YouTube right now, so you can find us on any of those platforms.
Okay.
Usually it's a question that we have at the end, or I've developed as a reporter, is there any big important questions that we didn't ask or anything in particular that you'd want to stress at the end? This is your time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that we didn't talk about is indigenous rights in Wyoming in particular. So we have one of, the largest reservations in the country. 2% of the Wyoming population, 1 in 50 people in Wyoming are indigenous people. And that's, I mean, even if it was a much smaller percentage than that, it would still be important. But this is not a small number of people. And, I really hope that the state legislature does their thing and makes it so the tribal IDs are okay for voting. I actually haven't been I knew it made it through the first reading, and I think that's where it's sitting at the moment. But I think also a lot of laws cracking down on protest have basically been an attempt to crack down on indigenous people finding their voices. And so, I'm really deeply uncomfortable with that sweeping of laws happening around the country. And I think that indigenous people should be, a big part of the conversation about what do we do about climate disruption, because they come from a cultural background where these problems weren't happening at that level. And so, I think there's a lot of wisdom there that we should be tapping into.
All right. Anything else? Still your time.
Still my time. Oh, my goodness. Ending Citizens United.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a whole bunch of ways that we make voting difficult, so, yeah. And I think money and politics, I mean, looking at...
Yeah. For those who don't know the crib sheet, just explain that's a Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, it's basically what it says is that you can dump as much money into politics as you want, and that money is speech, protected speech, and money is not speech. And what it does is it just basically means that the 1% runs the show, and looking at Michael Bloomberg, coming in late into the thing, buying up a huge amount of, he's literally paying people to say nice things about him on social media.
His ads every 10 seconds on TV.
Well, and during the debate, I mean, that it is unconscionable that he was allowed to be doing his ads during the debate. But this is what people it's sort of the larger than life version of many more subtle variations of what people with a lot of money are able to do in terms of affecting our politics. And so Bloomberg is a bridge too far for me. So, yeah. But that whole complex of, one person, one vote, superdelegates are almost all wealthy people. There's just this whole complex of ways that, money has messed up our political system. I mean, I was told by multiple people, don't run unless you can raise at least $1 million. And I'm like, I have a negative net worth. I don't hang out with millionaires. And that's kind of our standard line. And so we're not accepting PAC money. I haven't had any billionaires donate to me so far, as far as I know.
They usually let you know.
They usually let you know because there's things attached to it. Yeah, so...
or so I'm guessing. I mean, I've not had that phone call, but I'm assuming.
I mean, I had someone jokingly say they'd give me $1,000 if and then he was like, I'm joking, you just have $1,000. I'm like, great. Those are the big donations I've been getting. I mean, I think we really, really desperately need to get money out of politics. I'd love to see elections be publicly funded.
All right. Well, you've been very gracious with your time and opinions today. We appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Good.
Yeah. We need to do it again.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And then
Next
when you're in office, you need to do it again.
Well, and you know what? I commit that if I am in office, I will actually show up to keep having conversations with normal people.
On this side of the state, not just in Jackson Hole and Cheyenne. So we would appreciate that.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, so far, Sweetwater County has been the county I've spent the most time in, other than the county I live in. So,
cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, and good luck launching a podcast. It's very exciting.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.